to take this session forward, I shall now invite Ms. Devyani Chaubil, Senior Director, UNext, on stage, please. Can we have a huge round of applause, everybody?
Yeah, hi. I represent UNext, and we are in the space of talent transformation, focusing on emerging tech, IT, data science. I'd like to invite Sankarson Banerjee here. I know him for last 30 years. He was my colleague in IBM. And over 30 years, what has remained kind of a very highlighted portion of his career has been the training part of it. He has a great passion towards learning and teaching, technology and BFSI. So we thought it'll be another thing which we are noticing in the enterprise segment, because we work a lot in the enterprise segment for talent transformation in IT as well as in BFSI and other non-IT company, that the requests that are coming from the BFSI sector are increasingly like the IT sector. So we're inviting Sankarson Banerjee to share his thoughts as to how he sees the BFSI, the talent, and the technology space folding, coming together and folding over the years. Yeah, thanks.
So I'm Sankarson Banerjee, but nobody gets that, so Shanky. I recently quit as CIO of RBL Bank. Recently, 6 months ho gaya abhi. And I've been working in and out of BFSI for a long time, including some parts in the US. And I can tell you, BFSI increasingly is faced pressures that it never used to face before. Technology was always part of BFSI, but technology change was never part of BFSI. Citibank is still using mainframes from the 1960s. And there are many banks. In fact, some of the world's largest users of old mainframes and COBOL is still the banking system. And that is because banking, by and large, did not change for a long time. It is only recently that, especially in India, by the way, in US, banking has still not changed to a certain extent. When I first went to the US, they told me it would take 7 days for a check deposited in my own branch to clear. And I used to be used to ICICI, where, it would take 7 seconds or so. This was quite some time ago. And banking, by and large, because it deals with money, it deals with economic actually has stayed quite the same for a long time. What has really changed in India is, the slides of my previous speaker really highlighted. Essentially, the payments landscape has changed quite dramatically. And with that, pretty much everything in banking has changed. And banking has now become far more like e-commerce, far more like an IT company than like the traditional institutional, where you went to one big building and stood in line and, got your own money out after 2 hours. I'm of the age that did that. One of my first jobs when I was 10 years old for my mother was to hold on to that token and stand at the branch. The branch was right next door. And as soon as our number was called, to signal to my mother to come and get the money. Because it would take a couple of hours. And banking in India has changed beyond all recognition, and frankly, we are far ahead of the rest of the world in that sense. Even in digital payments, we are double the rest. In fact, I suspect we are more than the rest of the world combined. So we have that way leapfrogged. What has really become a problem, therefore, is talent. We have done a lot with what we have. But increasingly, and this is a problem I faced I used to be in National Stock Exchange, I used to be in RBL. It's a problem that I've faced again and again and again. And I've tried overcoming it in 3 or 4 different ways. We are sucking in talent as we grow, and the banking system in India is growing. In fact, this year, the banking system in India is the most profitable banking system in the world. We have suddenly declared very good profits after cleaning up our balance sheets and provisioning adequately. Suddenly, across the board, public sector, private sector, we are one of the most profitable banking systems in the world. All this is causing a huge drain or a huge competition for resources. Now, resource supply is relatively fixed. So therefore, we have to figure out how to reskill, how to redo things with what we already have. And that's why I have a 4-point talk and no slides. I'm actually one of the, I liked Guy Kawasaki's talk many years ago about how you should put only one idea per slide in 32-point font. I took it a little bit further, no slides. The ideas come from me, 4 ideas. But the first idea. So first thing is tactical. First thing that we have all to do is we are modernizing a lot of our systems across the board. It's not that RBL is doing it or ICICI is doing it. Everybody is modernizing across the board. Because the demands of the new world are quite different and the old world tends to go out of support. So people tend to modernize faster and faster. People are implementing new things more and more. Banks, for instance, a few years ago across the board implemented CRM systems. Now we are implementing payment systems. Many things we are constantly implementing. We are constantly upgrading. We are constantly doing things to our existing systems. We no longer have the luxury of buying one mainframe and leaving it untouched for 10 years. And that requires a significant level of tactical skilling. People who know the system, people who understand how to upgrade and tweak Finacle or upgrade and tweak Salesforce and things like that. And there my recommendation is hire bright youngsters and train them. It used to be that you needed somebody who knew the system for 5 years. But, today nobody knows the system for 5 years. The system is 5 years old. The only guy who knows it for 5 years is the founder. So it's a fool's errand to say, I know the system for 5 years. And frankly, and I've realized, with my own nieces and nephews and all that, they do technology better than us. They understand the technology better than us because they are living it day to day. So tactically speaking, to implement a system, you're probably better off with somebody just out of college. Where you have to do is make sure he understands the systems and processes of working. He's no longer in college where he sits in chappals, drinks tea and does whatever he likes in a computer. That is the part that increasingly we are doing. Hire freshers direct from college. Don't wait for experienced skills. And of course, do extensive retraining. This is what the Infosys of the world have been doing. In fact, as I said, banks are becoming, everybody is now saying that actually banks are IT companies with a license, with a financial sector license. And this DBS quite openly says it, that they are a bank, they are basically an IT company. They hire like an IT company, their offices look like IT companies. Actually, now all our offices look like IT companies. When was the last time somebody went into even a public sector bank that looked like a public sector bank? What used to be a public sector bank, rows of desks and peons walking between. So the thing is, therefore I encourage all of you to start hiring at the bottom and train very aggressively. And this need for lateral experience, you should actually, one is you won't get it, that the demand for lateral skills is quite high. So you will get a few, which you will still need, but by and large you won't get as many as you want. You will not get 20 Salesforce implementers, 20 good Salesforce implementers. The rest of the people who have written 3 years of Salesforce are junk. They actually, they know how to spell it, but nothing much more. And this is something that I used to be, in Accenture and in Emphasis, in IBM. And this is a challenge we faced all the time. People would say, we know .NET, but actually his friend's nephew knew .NET and he knew how to spell it. It is something that you had to take relatively junior people and train them. And the smart guys get trained very quickly, and those are the guys you deploy. This, by the way, is the McKinsey model. The $1 million you pay is actually for people just out of college. Because McKinsey takes really smart people and then trains them. And the training, of course, is quite good. Plus, they realize that if you take smart people, they can pretty much do anything. Strategy is not as hard as McKinsey pretends it is. The same way, technology, especially today, is not as hard as it used to be. It used to take far more skill to run a mainframe than it takes today to run a really large cloud setup. Actually, I have had, in fact, one of the video bloggings I did during the pandemic while I was in RBL, I invited 3 11-year-olds to come and show us how they developed. One guy had developed a mobile app, one had developed a game, one had developed training courses on Python. And in one case, the training course guy had to tell him to dumb it down because he was using Emacs. which requires a significant learning curve. None of my team knew how to do Emacs. So I told them, no, you don't use Emacs, you please use Visual Studio or something that other people understand. So 11-year-olds are doing this. And they find the tools easy to understand, and they find the tools much easier to use. And that is what we need to take juniors out of college, train them, and they'll anyway be, everybody will leave in 2 years. But that's part of your process. But the second part is, once you get your implementations in line, you still have to make sure that the adoption of it happens, that the users are trained to use it. This is one of those big problems that we all have, I'm sure. All of you have implemented systems that finally nobody uses. Not because the system is not useful, but because nobody quite knows how to use it. Or they are unused to. And I'll give you a recent example. I purchased a very nice, easy to use, ransomware-proof backup software. It works very well. It backs up perfectly, it restores perfectly. Every time an update happens, I noticed somebody was saying 3 hours it takes to back up. I was saying, kuch to gadbad hai, it is continuously backing up. He said, no, that is backing up, but we don't use that. We actually create a private copy, which takes 3 hours, just in case something goes wrong. And it reminds me that my mother used to, write by hand everything that she totaled up on the computer. She would actually, balance checkbooks on the computer, so she would use a spreadsheet, and then they would check the calculation by hand. So this is something like that. People are unused to new systems. So they very often either don't use it at all, or they use it reluctantly, but they anyway actually are doing their work on the old system. And this is a problem, again, across the board. There's nothing special about this problem. It has been there since technology was invented. But as I said, as the rate of change accelerates, this becomes a bigger and bigger problem. And therefore, training your end users becomes a really serious problem. You need to train your end users into how to use what you've just implemented. You bought a car, now you need to teach the guy to drive. That part is something that we also realized fairly recently in my last job, that we were falling behind on. In branches, for instance, people would often do things by hand and then at the end of the day type it into the computer instead of doing it directly on the computer. And things like that. So we realized that that is a very important part. You need to upskill people on all the new stuff that you spent a few crores implementing. And you need to upskill at the same time. You cannot say that first we'll implement, then we'll upskill, because upskilling is a long cycle. So the last time we implemented a Finacle upgrade, we spent a lot of time doing parallel upskilling, including, and there are lots of tools again, including simulations, including, their system, the new system with the old code, old data. So that it, what would happen if you had the same system 5 years ago or 2 years ago? Things like that. A lot of the stuff, a lot of demo videos, but upskilling the workforce, the systems who will use, the people who will use the system is actually quite underestimated at the moment. That's why many of the projects never get very much usage. The third is, and that is the biggest challenge of all, is to change the culture of a business to digital. And pandemic probably gave us the best example. All of us worked for banks where it basically said remote working is impossible. We cannot do remote working, it will not work. Bank will collapse if we do remote working. Till pandemic came along, our idea of remote working was, after the 10 guys who work till 8 o'clock in the night leave, they can do their email at home. That was remote working. Everything else was you had to come to the office. Physically come to the office, physically be inside that secure zone. Only then will it work. It just cannot be done outside. And yet the pandemic changed all that. All of us, the most primitive of banks and the most advanced of banks all did remote working pretty much overnight and nothing broke down. India, in fact, did very well on remote working. The entire economy ran even in spite of a very strict lockdown. And that's the thing. People became digital in this particular sense when forced to. They adapted their ways of working, they adapted how the meetings were done, they adapted how transcribing was done. Even today, my housing society, one guy is struggling to understand this remote way of working. He says, no, minutes should be circulated in print. Except that he lives in Dubai, so circulating in print is not trivial. But he says, I'm used to minutes being circulated in print, I'm very uncomfortable with this. And I told him, but our board meetings don't have minutes circulated in print. Tum housing society ki baat kar rahe ho. So that way of, that cultural change is very important. And that change is probably the hardest to drive, strategy eaten by culture for breakfast. Many of us, and especially in the BFSI actually, the cultural change is starting to happen. That has to be accelerated. Even today we spend more on branch banking than on mobile banking, even though mobile banking is the bulk of our banking. Most customers in India interact with their banks through the mobile phone. But if you look at expenditure numbers, we spend more on branch banking, much more. Because that's how that digital transformation is yet to take place. We are yet to say that we will culturally move away. I mean, it is happening far faster than before. In India, we are definitely ahead of the curve on this cultural transformation to digital in BFSI. In BFSI, we are probably been at least, maybe not the best in the world, but definitely one of the best 2 or 3 countries in the world. But even then, there's a large path to go. To change, again, that requires retraining, rethinking, replanning our organizational structures. Our organizational structures are still all branch banking centric. Our support structures are very vertical centric. Customers are not centered that way. Customers don't think of a transaction being so siloed. For instance, till recently, if I was an account holder of a bank, let's say a savings bank account holder, and I wanted an FD, I would have to go resubmit KYC. And if I wanted a housing loan, I would have to resubmit KYC again. Even if I wanted in the same session, sometimes I would have to submit 2 copies of the KYC. I go to the branch, I want an FD and a housing loan at the same time, I have to create 2 copies of the KYC. That was how it was till recently. Because they were vertical silos, there was no rethinking of the internal culture to be digital. Again, it's getting better. Now, by and large, I still have to submit KYC physically every once in a while, but it's gotten a lot better. That transformation requires constant retraining, and the faster you do it, the more competitive you are, the more your market advantage happens. This culture of technology being embedded into your business process is not trivial. And again, it's probably not just up to the CIO, but the CIO can definitely drive a lot of it. So the fact that something else we did in my previous company, it kind of happened organically, and then we speeded it up. We realized, since most people do mobile banking, actually most people come to the branch to ask for help in mobile banking. This is an actual observed behavior. So we started teaching our branch staff on the intricacies of mobile banking. Okay, actually this is there, that is there, this one doesn't quite work the way you think it does. And they became support staff for mobile banking, which is what the customer wanted anyway. The customer actually didn't really want to come to the branch. He had come to the branch because he couldn't quite figure it out on the mobile. That was a large chunk of our customers. And we sort of accelerated this along by, making it formal. But it was happening anyway. The customers were coming to the branches were getting smarter at giving that kind of help to the customers. So that is another thing you should strongly focus on. This business of changing culture to fit technology. Because technology is going to move faster than you think. And there are competitive advantages. And technology, many people say, but we can ignore the change. Yes, you can, for a while. But then when you're faced with the change, it'll be a much larger jump. You can ignore the change for a long time, and then you'll have to jump a lot, as opposed to constantly, incrementally doing changes. Because the change will happen. The change is happening independent of you. Things will go out of support even if they work perfectly well. Like COBOL. COBOL is a good example. There's nothing wrong with the language. It works perfectly well. There was a time when it ran the entire financial system of the globe, which wasn't that small in those days. But, where would you get a COBOL compiler today? Forget people. You can train people, but where would you get the compiler? Where would you get the software that, let's say, monitors COBOL? That's the part that becomes a challenge. The infrastructure goes away. It's a bit like buying a vintage car. A vintage car will run fine. Except that if your spark plug goes bad, you can't repair it. And that's your challenge. You will be forced to change because technology moves on. And even if your technology works perfectly well, the underlying ecosystem has moved on. And this is what happened to my ambassador. I had a Mark IV, which I loved. nice grey-colored Mark IV Ambassador, very smooth. But spark plug kharab ho gaya, to too bad. It has happened to a lot of people Tata Nanos. Anyway, the last thing. You see, all this is internal. So far, I've been talking about how the company can change internally for its own benefit. But remember, we are there for our customers. We keep saying so, but most of our activities are not geared to our customers. They are geared to internal improvements. The customer part is becoming a big challenge because as the space opens up to things like payments, customer behavior becomes much more difficult to predict. Therefore, problems and problem statements become far less well-defined. It's much easier to say, I will pay 6% interest on FDs. How does Finacle change to show that 6% to the branch? That's a very straightforward problem. You don't need fancy tools to do it. It's much harder to say, how will I create a mobile phone that people will use without too much effort? The problems are becoming much more like e-commerce, much more like IT services, much more like Facebook and, Game of Thrones and all that. Therefore, the approach to design, the approach to solving it also has to change quite dramatically. We keep hearing of user journeys, but the fact is user journeys are very hard to define. Users don't have distinct journeys. They tend to, depending on who the user is, tend to move all over the place. I used to be in e-commerce, and we had done this beautiful website with, cascading menus. You click on the plus sign and it expands, and you click on the plus sign and it expands again. And we thought, beautiful. It's very easy to navigate. We ran a few user tests. Everybody loved it. Adoption was terrible. And after a while, we figured out our customers don't understand the plus sign. See, our customers are not the average user. He's not a PC user. He's a grocer in my first e-commerce order was from Saharanpur. I launched it at midnight, 12:01, one order came from Saharanpur. The Saharanpur grocer doesn't understand the plus sign. So he buys whatever is on the first page and never goes beyond it. So then we went out and checked a few sites and we realized Amazon, which is the king of all this, does not have a plus sign. They just have everything on the menu, like a huge long list. So their list is very long and you have to scroll down and all that. So we said, okay, we'll do that. And it, of course, did indeed help. And that's the challenge. So that approach is called design thinking, where you start thinking about how to address unstructured problems, called wicked problems. Problems that are hard to state itself. And then, of course, the solution is also hard to state, so you have to iteratively improve it. You cannot say, okay, this is the exact problem, but the answer is unknown. That is, hota hai to acha hai, but it's no longer the case in real life. As our universe has grown to be more open, our problems have become much more open-ended. And therefore, you need design thinking. You need iterative thinking, solving, 50 times over till you come to a final finished product. And so that was my fourth piece. Now I'd like to invite, I'm sorry, I forgot Vinay back on stage.
Thank you. Can we give a big round of applause to Mr. Sankarson? Thank you so much. Thank you for those great insights. So my name is Vinay. I represent Unext. I take care of all the competency development that we do at Unext. And it was such a privilege for us to have Mr. Sankarson give his insights from on the ground, right, as to what talent workforce readiness really means. So I'm going to take the next 4-5 minutes to talk about from the implementation side, right? He spoke about the 4 points. From the implementation side, what we have seen, hiring, when you hire, when you train existing talent, and when you want to train senior leadership. So I'll quickly run through some of these slides. We are part of the Manipal group. Manipal group is known for hospitals and, of course, the education. So we represent the Manipal group, entity called Unext. What we do is we do skilling across entry-level, mid-level leadership. And a lot of it is for the BFSI sector, for the IT services, for product companies, we do that. So we bring in a lot of expertise from that perspective. Now, if you look at the problem statement, which let's come to the fresh talent, right? We have lakhs of fresh grads. Sankarson was talking about smart kids, but you have the tier 1 colleges, tier 1 cities, but you also have the tier 2, tier 3, right? And many of them, the syllabuses in colleges is not tuned with what is required by the industry, and we all know that there is the gap. There's a lot of gap right there, right? So a couple of things that we have observed is, we've done trainings for the IT services. There is a huge demand there. The demand is growing in BFSI, but what happens there is they have a strong campus connect, strong pipeline visibility of how many people they want to onboard. Of course, there are some challenges this year because of the US economy and other stuff, but they know how to brand and they have a lot of drives, which is not there truly in the BFSI space. Because Abhi the whole idea is, mera beta Infosys mein jayega. I'm talking about a tier 2 town, right? Infosys has more aspiration than him or her getting a job in a bank. So how that branding has to be done, and you develop deep campus connect, because the career path with the way technology is changing, the opportunities in BFSI in terms of the niche work, in terms of compensation, is extremely high. We just saw the IT adoption which is happening across this sector. So struggling to get the right talent, many of the companies that we work with, they struggle to really find the right people who have that thinking, because a lot of day 1, day 2 companies are going into the high product companies or the Amazons or the Facebooks of the world, and then the IT service companies. So there is a big gap, right? So one of the ways, now, see, talent, we always say, like, it's like a piece of stone removing the unnecessary part, correct? Everybody has the potential. Now, if you go to a smaller town like a Kolhapur, I'm sure there'll be kids who have that talent, but can we groom them? Is there some way we can find and polish them? So one of the models that we have done is go out, give a mentoring, give a guided mentoring, and see if the person has the learnability, right? Because the attitude matters everything. The rest of the skills, like Sankarson was saying, can always be taught. So we followed this model, and it's given us amazing success. So many times it's the direction which they don't know. People end up going and learning through plethora of online courses. It's also technical. They get degrees, paper certificates, but no hands-on. There's a cloud certification, but very limited hands-on. There's a AI/ML certification, but very limited hands-on, right? So you give a guided mentoring of probably 3 hours a day for 8 days, right? 24 hours. Give them a project to work, and you'll be amazed as to kids who have the potential, how well they come out. So once I know the potential is there, that becomes a new talent pipeline. So we're talking about how to create new talent pipeline. So in our organization, we have the School of FinTech with all this, lending, payment, insure, wealth, with the plethora of technologies. A lot of it was already mentioned, in the previous talk. So we offer all these programs, but, when you say I want to develop a full stack developer, it has to be in the context of what he or she is going to apply in the bank. For example, if I'm teaching Java technology, I'm going to teach them how to create insurance app, or how to create, a marketplace app. And what they're going to use when they create that marketplace app is a low-code, no-code platform, minimal automation, right? And when you challenge them to do that, they come up with amazing results with actually installing that on the Play Store. So we have done that, very relevant to what they do. Some of the technology tracks, that we do, blockchain, data engineering, RPA, all of these stuffs as part of our skilling programs. Now, most important is, traditionally the training is, you do some basic concepts, you put in technology on top of it, and you do some project hands-on, and then you deploy them, put into project. But then what we have tried is other models of 30, 60, 90. You do 30 days, put them into project, right? Immerse, get them back, let them learn something, put them into project, get them back. I'm telling you, this is, again, what happens is many times, even though I give a project which is contextual, but unless they actually get onto the floor and they get the culture, they imbibe the mindset and the seriousness or the pulse of what is required is very different from what happens as a traditional training, right? So we've done this for another of our BFSI client, and they were struggling with people not being ready even after the training, right? And the very few people people did not have time, internal people did not have time to mentor them, right? So this is the progression we see. You recruit, career, fresh blood, high energy, the guerrilla teams, but that kind of gets subdued as they get experienced, and then, you're looking at homegrown successes at the leadership level. So upskilling programs become very important. Upskilling programs where you have work-integrated learning programs, where you have campus to corporate, but you bring campus right inside the corporate, right? And create that zeal. See, we say technology can give touch points, but those touch points have to have an emotional connect, right? We all watch movies because we have emotional connect, right? Can we bring in that emotional connect back into learning so that learning just doesn't become a chore, it actually is driven from within, right? So that's how we bring in a program. So you need to get product mindset, right? Otherwise, typically in a bank or in any of the complex, large-scale digital transformation implementation, there are silos, like Sankar was mentioned, right? There are too many projects happening in silos, and ultimately it becomes a mess. People leave, attrition happens, and nobody has a clue of what has happened, correct? Versus having a product approach where you put every requirement as a feature, you release it in sprints, and you have a long-term product approach, right, as to what you're building. So product mindset, depending on whether you're a technologist or a generalist or a business-oriented, you bring in the design thinking and actually go through a program where you say BYOP, which is build your own product, right? So this is what we do. Business analyst, technical product owner, technical product manager, very, very exciting, which has not just the functional skills, but also the professional and the leadership skills, right? So, and lastly, I want to end with this. Many of the organizations, they're also looking at, since you're now transitioning from banks are becoming technical companies, to become technology companies, the skill available, the competency dictionary being defined is very important, because you have to have a complete new competency playbook that you have to design, right? So either a role-based or a skill-based, which means you have to establish the competency dictionary, the learning part. So we've done that for organizations. We've sat down, revisited the whole competency dictionary, and create your journey maps, and then you implement your learning. And finally, whether it is you want to do for senior leadership, branch managers, or for a center of excellence for analytics, right? You want to do data science, you want to do technology, some sample programs. But very important, today we do a lot of programs for senior leaders. Why? Because senior leaders are the real enablers for digital transformation. So you do programs where, as a senior leader, the top level, the C-suite, you teach them enterprise architecture in that context and help them to do some hands-on with a low-code, no-code kind of a platform where they learn the nuts and the bolts, right? So everybody has to embrace technology, right? But it's with what context? They say content is king, but engagement is the queen, but the context is the kingdom, right? So everybody has a lot of content here, right? Engagement is important, but in what context you will teach that is important. So this is another thing, another example for a broking company that we have done, different modules, but interspersed with the right engagement, with the right context. And finally, I'll end with this. We say learning cannot be plug and play. You cannot just say, come learn, right, like a commodity. Learning is a very personal thing, but it's a journey. You learn from your guru, from your teacher, you learn on your own, but you have to create an ecosystem where it is more culturally driven. You can build communities. We encourage a lot of social learning today. In fact, we have a platform called epic.u where we encourage social learning, where you can drive communities. The CIO or the CSO, Chief Security Officer, runs their own communities. They post content. Today is the world of social media. Can you replicate that in organizations where learning can be driven with I, as a top leader, getting connected to a fresh bee who's created some new app and he posts that. So can I create that link? Can new people can some of the fresh guys or people joining at the lateral, can they get to understand what is the mindset of this organization? Can they get the buy-in into the culture of the organization, right? So driving that through social learning, through community learning, all that becomes very important. That's where your classmates, your peers, over the period of time, how you can, make learning fun. Make learning as a pull rather than a push, and that becomes a win-win for all. So with that, I'm done with this, with my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity, and back to our host.
Requesting Mr. Vinayak, you next, to please be on stage, and joining him on the stage will be Mr. Banerjee, Consultant Technology, RBL Bank. Please be on stage, and I shall now request Mr. Abhineet Sarkar, Innovation Leader, Digital Solutions, Tata AIA Life Insurance, to please come on stage to felicitate Mr. Vinayak from UNext and Mr. Banerjee.